RGE here, and we're going to be talking about Thief, Deadly Shadows. There's a few reasons why I wanted to do an episode on this game. One of the reasons is that the Thief series to me is just kind of the definition of a stealth game. The other reason is that Thief Deadly Shadows was made by Ion Storm, which is an interesting company as far as game development goes. They made some outstanding games, did just some amazing things, but they also made some terrible, terrible mistakes and did awful things. So, Thief Deadly Shadows was released in 2004 for the original Xbox and PC, and it was developed by Ion Storm, who made the original Deus Ex, as well as Deus Ex Invisible War. They also made some other games. For example, they made Daikatana, which was a game that was from John Romero, and it was a first-person shooter for the Game Boy Color. And then later it was ported to the N64. So, Ion Storm was founded like in the mid-90s, and they ended up actually closing down in 2005. Their first release was Dominion Storm Over Gift 3, which was released in 1998. Then they released John Romero's Daikatana in 2000 alongside Deus Ex. Deus Ex is considered to be just one of the best games ever made. And it is really a great game that easily withstands the test of time. It was an amazing game. And then in 2001, they released Anachronox. I'll never pronounce it correctly. And in 2003, we got Deus Ex Invisible War. And then in 2004, they released Thief Deadly Shadows, which would be their last game that they ever released. Ion Storm, they kind of fell into the same traps that a lot of companies did in the 90s, especially software companies. They were overspending on their offices, a lot on decorations. They went really overboard on where their offices were, and they didn't really have any practical reason being where they were. They also tended to have some fairly bad development practices. For example, Daikatana was announced to be released in 1997. Well, I just said it came out in the year 2000. It was 3 years delayed, and that ended up actually pissing a lot of people off. A lot of John Romero fans were not pleased with that at all. Now, one of the main reasons why it ended up being delayed so long was that they converted the game from the Quake 1 engine to the Quake 2 engine. But they were already pretty far into development. So that's a huge thing to do, to just change engines. The game ended up being hugely delayed. They did the same thing, I believe, with Anachronox. Not that I'll ever pronounce that correctly. But they were 6 months into development of the game, and then they switched engines. They ended up delaying the game again and going over budget. Switching engines is like one of the most expensive things you can do, because you're basically starting the game over. You've wasted everything that you've done before that. Really, at the end of the day, Ion Storm just went way over budget on a lot of their titles, and they just didn't seem focused on development as much as they were focused on extravagance. Now to finally talk about the game that I'm supposed to be talking about. I have this terrible habit of going off topic sometimes, but it's okay. You'll learn to deal with it. So, Deadly Shadows is actually the third game in the series for Thief. The first two were developed by Looking Glass Studios. Looking Glass Studios shut down in 2000, and a substantial amount of their employees ended up being hired to work at Ion Storm Austin. Deadly Shadows is also the first in the Thief series to be released on console. This pushed Ion Storm to name the game Thief Deadly Shadows instead of Thief 3, because they didn't want to isolate possible newcomers to the series who would be coming from the Xbox. Thief takes place in like the late medieval era to the early Victorian era, and you play as the master thief Garrett. The series has some fantasy elements, such as demons and mages, and There's also a bit of a steampunk element to the game at times. In my opinion, Thief 3 tells its story really well. Garrett is approached by a member of the Keepers, which is actually an organization that Garrett used to belong to. So the Keepers are one of the major factions in the game, and they're kind of this mysterious, magical organization that tries to keep the world in balance. And he's asked to steal 2 Keeper artifacts back from the Hammerites, who are a strict religious organization that are also one of the major factions in the Thief series, and the other artifact from the Pagans, who worship nature and chaos, and they are another major faction in the series. There's several major factions in this game, and in the whole series, actually, that are pretty important to story. However, if you jump in to, let's say, Thief 3, and you haven't played the first 2, they're explained well enough through lore objects that you can find in the game that you'll understand what's going on reasonably well. However, you won't get any of Garrett's backstory for the most part, but you'll get enough lore for the other factions. They do a good job of explaining who the Hammerites are, who the Pagans are, who the Keepers are, and so on. They just don't do a particularly great job of explaining who Garrett is in the third one. So you'll probably want to do some background research before you start playing this game, if you've never played it before. So in exchange for stealing these 2 artifacts back for the Keepers, Garrett is allowed access to the Keeper's prophecies. After Garrett learns the prophecies, he decides to set them in motion. Once he does set them in motion, someone dies and Garrett's framed for murder. That's as far into the plot as I'm going to go, but I'm sure that you can guess the rest of the major plot points just off of that. Something Thief 3 does really well in its storytelling that tends to be missing from most major releases now is that it lets you play the story. Instead of having large amounts of cutscenes, it uses them sparingly and lets you just play through areas that could be cutscenes. With a name like Thief, you can safely assume that it's a stealth game. Hiding in the shadows and being as silent as possible is completely necessary. I'm not going to really talk about sneaking mechanics. They're sneaking mechanics. You want to be quiet, and you don't want to be seen. If you're discovered, you have a couple options. You can try to use something like a flash bomb and try to escape and hide again. Or you can try to fight them directly using like your bow and your dagger. You'll die if you try to take that second option. Just like the city guards in the game, which are the weakest unit that you'll face pretty much, are substantially stronger than you. They can pretty much kill you in 2 hits. This is the reason why a lot of modern stealth titles just don't work for me. They've reduced the strength of the enemy and made stealth unnecessary, because if I'm just as strong as the rest of the enemy, then I might as well just shoot them all. For me, the Thief series is like the definitive stealth series, and Thief 3 does a really great job of maintaining what Thief 1 and 2 did great, and add some new features and improvements that made it fresh and kind of like stand out on its own from the prior 2. There's 2 major additions that come with Thief 3 to the series. Thief 3 is the first of the series to add an open world to the game. Previous to this, you would just do mission after mission and navigate through like a mission screen. In Thief 3, you're given several mission options and you need to travel through the city and find the entrance to the missions. And while you're in the open city, you can find useful things like maps for the missions that you're going to go do, and you can find some kind of like side quests of sorts that will, if completed, help you later in the game in some way. For example, you find this weird fish man who is imprisoned early on in the game, and you can free him from prison, and he will escape and run amok in the streets. I can't remember how he affects you later in the game, because when I was replaying the game for this video, I didn't actually play the whole game, because it's like reasonably long, just because there's so many missions to do, and the missions are challenging, that it takes quite a while to beat the game. Another major addition to the game, however, much more minor in comparison to having open worlds added to the game, is the ability to cling to walls. This feature just makes it easier to hide in the narrower shadows that would lie against the bottom of walls. A major complaint that I have in regards to this game is just the really frequent load screens. The levels are broken into a bunch of smaller chunks, and you hit load screens just really often. This is probably because the game was designed with the original Xbox in mind. It's not really a big issue since it loads really quickly on a modern system, but there's just a ton of them. Now on to game-breaking bugs that only exist on modern systems. There's actually only one of them, and it's really easy to fix. If you're getting over 60 FPS, then the lockpicking animation breaks, and you get thrown out of the lockpicking minigame. Obviously, being a thief, you need to pick locks. Like, you actually have to. It's not something just to open up a chest for a side objective. The game is broken. You can't even get through the tutorial without being able to pick locks. This is a dead easy fix. You have to enable VSync, except that VSync in the game is broken, so you need to enable it in your GPU configurations. Besides the lockpicking issue, there are no other major bugs that make the game unplayable. However, there is an FOV mod that enables 16:9 resolutions up to 1080p that you can find on PC Gaming Wiki. The only thing that the mod breaks is that it scales the cinematics up, but it does it poorly because it's not intended to scale the cinematics, and then they just kind of look crappy. Thief 3, more than any of the others in the series, has withstood the test of time for me. The series' strong emphasis on stealth and incredibly challenging levels and NPCs make Thief 3's gameplay really strong. The reduction in difficulty and lack of major releases for true stealth games since like the earlier Splinter Cell games makes it a rarer experience, and is likely a major reason I think the gameplay still holds up so well. The game still looks reasonably good and feels like it has a level of depth that the prior two didn't have for me. Now, fans of the Thief series should feel pretty good about this. So, Eidos was the publisher for Ion Storm, and just like Deus Ex was revived by Eidos Montreal, Thief 4 has also been made by Eidos Montreal, and should be released somewhere in 2013. So we're actually going to see a sequel to Thief 3. And one of the things that was great about Thief 3 is that it ended the story of Garrett so well that they could either directly create a sequel for Thief 3, which I don't think they should. But the other option that they could do, since Thief 3 actually tied up the Garrett storyline quite well, is that they could just make a Thief 4 that references something that happened right at the end of Thief 3 that was actually pretty much the same as something that happened in Thief 1. So the series can actually get a complete reboot with Thief 4 and introduce all new characters and just keep the factions. And it would be just perfect and flow really well with the story. So I'm really excited for Thief 4 just because of what they could do story-wise. Like, they have the perfect setup to create a whole new story and realm for Thief, and I want to see them do it. At the end of the day, Thief 3 is worth going back and playing again if you own it, or buying it even. If you're a fan of the stealth genre and you haven't played any of the Thief series, can you really call yourself a fan of the stealth genre? I think that Thief 3 is actually a perfectly reasonable game to come into the series at, because they already designed the story for having new players join the series. So they do a more than reasonable job of explaining who all the factions are and what's going on. Obviously, like I said earlier, the only thing that they don't do particularly well is explaining who the hell Garrett is. However, that's okay. You can do a bit of research. We have the internet now. For me, Thief 3 has completely withstood the test of time, and it's just a fantastic game. Even now, there's nothing that I can compare to Thief 3 that can recapture what it did. I think the only games that are comparable for how well they do the stealth gameplay is the other Thief games.